Check 1 2, check 1 2. Hi, welcome back to Regaining the Balance. This is Matt. I have my new computer working now, and it looks like I will be able to be streaming now a lot more for you guys. So, good news. And it sounds good. Everything's looking like everything's working great. So, today we're going to be reading On the Contemplative Life or Suppliants by Philo of Alexandria. And it's a fascinating read, and it's going to give us quite a few little clues about what life was like in different ways during the first century in which he lived. And so, let's see here. Let me pull up the screen share here, and boom, here we go. Awesome. Okay, so just for a little bit of background, Philo of Alexandria was born around and died around 50 CE. So as you can see, he lived during this time period in which, if you're going with the official chronology, this is when Jesus Christ and the very beginning of Christianity kind of rose up. So that being said, let's get into it. On the Contemplative Life or Suppliants. Having mentioned the Essenes, who in all respects selected for their admiration and their special adoption for the practical course of life, and who excel in all, or what perhaps may be a less unpopular and invidious thing to say, in most of its parts, I will now proceed in the regular order of my subject to speak of those who have embraced the speculative life. And I will say what appears to me to be desirable to be said on the subject, not drawing any fictitious statements from my own head for the sake of improving the appearance of that side of the question, which nearly all poets and essayists are much accustomed to do in the scarcity of good actions to extol, but with the greatest simplicity, adhering strictly to the truth itself, to which I know well that even the most eloquent men do not keep close in their speeches. I'll just let you guys know, this is going to be about an hour. And if you like these kinds of stuff, please hit the like button, subscribe, all that good stuff. So continuing. Nevertheless, we must make the endeavor and labor to attain this virtue, for it is not right that the greatness of the virtue of the men should be a cause of silence to those who do not think it right that anything which is credible should be repressed in silence, but the deliberate intention of the philosopher is at once displayed from the appellation given to them, for which strict regard to etymology they are called Therapeutae and Therapeutides, from therapeu, to heal, either because they process an art of medicine more excellent than that in general use in cities, for that only heals bodies, but the other heals souls, which are under the mastery of terrible and almost incurable diseases, which pleasures and appetites, fears and griefs, and covetousness, and follies and injustice, and all the rest of the innumerable multitude of other passions and vices have inflicted upon them. I'd like to just point out real quick, this whole follies, covetousness, fears, griefs, appetites, pleasures. This is what is euphemistically known throughout so many writings, but the passions that we all deal with. So just to point that out real quick. So continuing, or else because they have been instructed by nature and the sacred laws to serve the living God, who is superior to the good and more simple than the one and more ancient than the unit, with whom, however, who is there of those who profess piety that we can possibly compare? Can we compare those who honor the elements, earth, water, fire, and air, to whom different nations have different names, calling fire Hephaestus, I imagine because of its kindling, the Greek is exapsis, as if Euphestos were also derived from aptomai, being akin to aphu, and the air, Hera, I imagine because of its being raised up. The Greek word is herasthai, which Hera, has become some similarity in sound. Herasthai sounds like heresy, doesn't it? And raised aloft to a great height in water, Poseidon, probably because of it being drinkable. The Greek word poton, derived from the third singular preferred passive of pino pepoptai, from the second singular of which peposai, Poseidon, may probably be derived. And the earth, Demeter, because it appears to be the mother. The Greek word is muter. That's interesting. Evidently the root demuter, of all the plants and all animals. But these names are the inventions of sophists. But the elements are inanimate matter and immovable by any power of their own, being subject to the operator on them to receive from him every kind of shape, distinctive quality which he chooses to give them. But what shall we say of those men who worship the perfect things made of them, the sun, the moon, and the other stars, planets or fixed stars, or the whole heaven, or the universal world? And yet even they do not owe their existence to themselves, but to some creator whose knowledge has been most perfect, both in mind and degree. What again shall we say of the demigods? What is a matter which is perfectly ridiculous? For how can the same man be both mortal and immortal, even if we leave out the question the fact that the origin of the birth of all these beings is liable to reproach as being full of youthful intemperance, which its authors endeavor with great profanity to impute to blessed and divine natures, as if they, being madly in love with mortal women, had connected themselves with them, while we know gods to be free from all participation in and from all influence of passion and completely happy. So I think he's just kind of like dissing the idea that the gods came down and had sex with, humans, and that kind of mythological idea. Again, what shall we say of those who worship carved works and images, the substances of which, stone and wood, were only a little while before perfectly destitute of shape before the stone cutters or wood cutters hewed them out of the kindred stuff around them, while the remainder of the material, their near relation and brother as it were, is made into ewers or footpans and other common and dishonored vessels, which are employed rather for uses of darkness than for such as will bear the light. Yes, a footpan is a use of darkness. This is kind of cool too, guys. Before I continue with the Egyptians part, is that this book it's like a little window into the past. He's giving commentary on the way people sort of do their own religious thing, and also kind of a couple of things within the cultural stuff as well. So it's pretty interesting. Continuing, as for the custom of the Egyptians, it is not credible even to mention them, for they have introduced irrational beasts, and those not merely such are domestic and tame, but even the most ferocious of wild beasts to share the honors of the gods, taking some out of each of the elements beneath the moon, as the lion from among the animals which live on the earth, the crocodile from among those which live in the water, and the kite from such as traverse the air, and the Egyptian iris. And though they actually see these animals are born, and that they are in need of food, and that they are insatiable in voracity and full of all sorts of filth, and moreover poisonous and devourers of men, and liable to be destroyed by all kinds of diseases, that is, in fact, they are often destroyed not only by natural death, but also by violence. Still they, civilized men, worship these untamable and ferocious beasts. Though rational men, they worship irrational beasts. Though they have a near relationship to the deity, they worship creatures unworthy of being compared even to some of the beasts. Though appointed as rulers and masters, they worship creatures which they by nature subjects and slaves. It's interesting that he makes this comment here. Though they have near relationship to the deity. There's a lot of veiled comments in this book, and a lot of things where he will mention stuff, and he just mentions it. He doesn't go into detail, and I think it's because he doesn't want to go into detail. And when those things pop up, I'll make sure to mention that to you guys. All right, section 2. But since these men infect not only their fellow countrymen, but also that all that come near them with folly, let them remain uncovered, being mutilated in that most indispensable of all the outward senses, namely sight. I am speaking here not of the sight of the body, but that of the soul, by which alone truth and falsehood are distinguished from one another. But the therapeutic sect of mankind, being continually taught to see without interruption, may well aim at obtaining a sight of the living God. It may pass by the sun, which is visible to the outward sense, and never leave this order which conducts to perfect happiness. But they who apply themselves to this kind of worship, not because they are influenced to do so by custom, nor by the advice or recommendation of any particular persons, but because they are carried away by a certain heavenly love, given away to enthusiasm, behaving like so many revelers in the bacchanalian or Corbintian mysteries, until they see the objects which they have been earnestly desiring. Then, because of their anxious desire for an immortal and blessed existence, thinking that their mortal life has already come to an end, they leave their possessions to their sons or daughters, or perhaps to other relations, giving them up their inheritance with willing cheerfulness. And those who know no relations give their property to their companions or friends, for it followed of necessity that those who have acquired the wealth which sees as if ready prepared for them should be willing to surrender that wealth which is blind to those who themselves are still blind in their minds. Now that is a very interesting section here. And I just like to point out that one of the things Jesus definitely does say, I can't remember exactly in which gospel or which ones, but he does say something to the effect of, give up all your things and follow me, that kind of idea. And so this is being sort of described as a part of what this sect kind of does. The people who join them have gotten to a point in their spiritual development where they literally are like, you know what, I don't need any of this, and they give it up. But in this, he's making a distinction that they don't just give it up, but they give up all their worldly acquirings to their various family and friends as a way of a token of love in that respect. But interestingly, I think this line is the most interesting. Should be willing to surrender that wealth which is blind to those who themselves are still blind in their minds. So essentially, they're giving the world back to the world itself. They're doing good, but either way, this is a good distinction here about their attitude. Here's an interesting correlation as far as how the Greeks kind of did this, and he kind of compares it. So continuing, the Greeks celebrated Anaxagoras and Democritus because they, being smitten with a desire for philosophy, allowed all their estates to be devoured by cattle. I myself admire the men who thus showed themselves superior to the attractions of money, but how much better were those who have not permitted cattle to devour their possessions, but have supplied the necessities of mankind, of their own relations and friends, and have made them rich though they were poor before. Surely that was inconsiderate conduct. I may avoid saying that any action of men whom Greece has agreed to admire was a piece of insanity, but this is the act of sober men, and one which has been carefully elaborated by exceeding prudence. For what more can enemies do than ravage and destroy and cut down all the trees in the country of their antagonists, that they may be forced to submit by reason of the extent to which they are oppressed by want of necessaries. And yet Democritus did this to his own blood relations, inflicting artificial want and penury upon them, nor perhaps from any hostile intentions toward them, but because he did not foresee and provide what was advantageous to others. I think that's a valid point. How much better and more admirable are they who, without having any inferior eagerness for the attainment of philosophy, have nevertheless preferred magnanimity to carelessness, and giving presents from their possessions instead of destroying them, so as to be able to benefit others and themselves also, having made others happy by imparting to them the abundance of their wealth, and themselves by the study of philosophy. For an undue care of money and wealth causes great waste of time, and it is proper to recognize time, since, according to the saying of the celebrated physician Hippocrates, life is short but art long. And this is what Homer appears to me to imply figuratively in the Iliad at the beginning of the 13th book by the following lines, quoting Homer: "The Mysian close-fighting bands and dwellers on the Scythian sands, content to see their humble fare from milk of cow and milk of mare, the justice of mankind." That's interesting. Milk of cow and milk of mare. This is kind of right out of the Rig Veda. Just saying. As if great anxiety concerning the means of substance and acquisition of money engendered injustice by reason of the inequality which it produced, while the contrary disposition of pursuit produced justice by reason of its equality, according to which it is that wealth of nature is defined, and is superior to that which exists only in vain opinion. When, therefore, men abandon their property without being influenced by any predominant attraction, they flee without even turning their heads back again, deserting their brethren and their children, their wives, their parents, their numerous families, their affectionate bands of companions, their native lands, in which they have been born and brought up, though long familiarity is a most attractive bond and one very well able to allure anyone. And I'd like to just quickly stop and just say that this idea of fleeing without turning their heads back again is something that I've covered before in the infancy of what was it again? It was a gospel, the infancy gospel of Jesus, but I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was in the video of the one of the Jesus the Phoenician videos, and then part of that gospel they talk about when Mary was a child, like she went into the temple to go live for a good portion of her life, and she turned back, and she left and never turned her head back again, which is just saying that she has an old way of saying that she has that divine devotion. I just wanted to point that out. So, continuing, and they depart not to another city as those who entreat to be purchased from those who at present possess them, being either unfortunate or else worthless servants, and as such seeking a change of masters rather than endeavoring to procure freedom. For every city, even that which is under the happiest laws, is full of indescribable tumults and disorders and calamities, which no one would submit to who had been even for a moment under the influence of wisdom. Let me just double check something here. Yep, okay, everything's good. All right. But they take up their abode outside of walls or gardens or solitary lands, seeking for a desert place, not because of any ill-natured misanthropy to which they have learnt to devote themselves, but because of the associations of wholly dissimilar dispositions to which they would otherwise be compelled, and which they know to be unprofitable and mischievous. So, just to break that down, they're basically saying that these Therapeutae find a place outside of these areas, and in that, let me just pop this here. And in that, and in these kind of deserted areas, we find these spots where they can concentrate on their spiritual development and all that kind of stuff. So it's something pretty interesting. And the funny thing is, I find it's really kind of cool too, is that there's a lot of these ideas in early Christianity. Or in Christianity, that this whole idea of monasticism and things like that you see in the East, like in places in India and in Tibet, and the Buddhists and whatnot, Jains and all that. They have very similar type of lifestyles. Like they separate themselves into these deserted areas for the purpose of spiritual development. So just wanted to point that out, because this is going to be a theme that's going to pop up a lot. So, section 3, now this class of persons may be met with in many places, for it was fitting that both Greece and the country of the barbarians should partake of this whatever is perfectly good, and there is the greatest number of such men in Egypt. In every one of the districts, or nomi as they are called, and especially around Alexandria, and from all quarters, those who are the best of these Therapeutae proceed on their pilgrimage to some most suitable places, if it were their country, which is beyond the Mareotic lake, lying in somewhat level plain, a little raised above the rest, being suitable for their purpose by reason of its safety and also of the fine temperature of the air. And he's going to go into a little bit of details on how they live. Let's see here. For the houses built in the fields and the villages which surround it on all sides give it safety, and the admirable temperature of the air proceeds from the continual breezes which come from the lake, which falls into the sea, and also from the sea itself into the neighborhood. The breezes from the sea being light, and those which proceed from the lake which falls into the sea being heavy, the mixture of which produces a most healthy atmosphere. But the houses of these men, thus congregated together, are very plain, just giving shelter in respect of those two things most important to be provided against, the heat of the sun and the cold from the open air. And they did not live near to one another as men do in cities, for immediate neighborhood to others would be troublesome and an unpleasant thing to men who have conceived an admiration for and have determined to devote themselves to solitude. And, on the other hand, they did not live very far from one another on account of the fellowship which they desired to cultivate, and because the desirableness of being able to assist one another if they should be attacked by robbers. So essentially, they're creating small hamlets, that are close but far enough away from each other. And in every house there is a sacred shrine which is called the holy place, and the monastery, that's right, in which they retire by themselves and perform all the mysteries of a holy life, bringing in nothing, neither meat nor drink or anything else which is indispensable towards supplying the necessities of the body, by studying in that place the laws and sacred oracles of God enunciated by the holy prophets and hymns and psalms and all kinds of other things, by reason of which knowledge and piety are increased and brought to perfection. Now, he's being very obtuse here. The oracles of God enunciated by the holy prophets, hymns, and so which holy prophets, Therefore, they always retain an imperishable recollection of God, so that not even in their dreams is any other subject ever present in their eyes, except the beauty of the divine virtues and of the divine powers. Therefore, many persons speak in their sleeps, divulging and publishing the celebrated doctrines of the sacred philosophy. You imagine some of these people like sneaking up at night with a little pad trying to write down the secrets. And they are accustomed to pray twice every day, at morning and at evening, when the sun is rising, entreating God that the happiness of the coming day may be real happiness, so that their minds may be filled with the heavenly light, and when the sun is setting, that they pray that their soul, being entirely lightened and relieved of the burden of the outward senses and of the appropriate objects of these outward senses, they may be able to trace out truth existing in its own consistory and council chamber. The interval between morning and evenings is by them devoted wholly to meditation on and practice of virtue, for they take up the sacred scriptures and philosophize concerning them, investigating the allegories of their national philosophy, which they look upon their literal expressions as symbols of some secret meaning of nature intended to be conveyed in those figurative expressions. And I'm going to have to point this out again. Take up the sacred scriptures. Which sacred scriptures is he talking about? Right? Investigating the allegories of their national philosophy. What does that mean? And this is what I mean by he's being obtuse, because later on in this book, he starts to throw in the Jewish Hebrew element. But up to a certain point, he references things, but he's never specific about it. And I find that to be very interesting, because this whole group of the Therapeutae and how he's describing them really feels like something that came from the East. Because there's not a whole lot of tradition when it comes to some of these other religions, that do these kinds of things. So, continuing, they have also writings of ancient men who have been the founders of one sect or another. Here we go again, right? Having left behind many memorials of the allegorical system of writing and explanation, whom they take as a kind of model, and imitate the general fashion of their sect, so they do not occupy themselves solely in contemplation, but they likewise compose psalms and hymns to God in every kind of meter and melody imaginable, which they of necessity arrange in more dignified rhythm. Now, this is also an interesting thing. Okay, so we have also writings of ancient men, whoever those guys are, right, who have been the founders of one sect or another. So right here, right off the top, I mean, just in as plain as language as he's ever gonna get, he's telling you that these people do not follow strictly the one specific religion, which should tell you that even during this time period, it was a melting pot of different things, and people were generally, okay with the fact that there were different religions. It's just really when people conquered and brought their whole thing in was when things got messy. And then another thing too is that they're talking about the system of writing and explanation, who they take a kind of a model and imitate in their fashion for their own sect. And then they talk about how they would create songs and stuff like that. So this has a very Kabbalistic / Pythagorean element to it. Both Pythagoras, first of all, was very concentrated a lot on the idea of music, and being that a big part of his philosophy. And even to get into a Pythagorean school, you had to prove that you had an understanding of music. And not to mention that he was an absolute genius when it came to mathematics. And I believe, in my opinion, that what people call the Kabbalah is way, way older. And I'll be going into that in future videos. But continuing, therefore, during 6 days, each of these individuals, retiring into solitude by himself, philosophizes by himself in one of the places called monasteries, never going outside the threshold of the outer court, and indeed never even looking out. But on the 7th day, I don't believe that, but on the 7th day, they all come together as if to meet in a secret assembly, and they sit down in order according to their ages, which all becoming gravity keep their hands inside their garments, having the right hand between their chest and their dress, and the left hand down their side close to their flank. And any of you guys that know anything about masonry and whatever else, that's something that they also do. And then the eldest of them, who has the most profound learning in their doctrines, comes forward and speaks with steadfast look and the steadfast voice, with great powers of reasoning and great prudence, not making an exhibition of his oratorical powers like the rhetoricians of old or the sophists of the present day, but investigating with great pains and in explaining with minute accuracy the precise meaning of the laws, which sits not intended at the tips of their ears, but penetrates through hearing into the soul, and remains there lastingly. And all the rest listen in silence to the to the praises which he bestows upon the law, showing their assent only by nods of the head or the eager look of the eyes. And this common holy place to which they all come together on the seventh day is a twofold circuit, being separated partly into the apartment of the men and partly into the chamber for the women. Listen to this very carefully. For women also, in accordance with the usual fashion there, from a part of the audience having the same feelings of admiration as the men, and having adopted the same sect with equal deliberation and decision, and the wall which is between the houses rises from the ground 3 or 4 cubits upward, like a battlement, and the upper portion rises upward to the roof without any opening, on 2 accounts. First of all, in order that the modesty which is so becoming to the female sex may be preserved, and secondly, that the women may easily be able to comprehend what is said, being seated within earshot, since there is then nothing which can be possibly intercept the voice of him who is speaking. Now, the reason I said pay attention to this is because the way that their communal situation is set up is has got a very, let's just say, yogic, kundalinic feel to it. So the room is split in half, with the wall being like the backbone, and you have the congregation of both men and women on both sides. And if you guys if you guys take a look, it's like Google Images and stuff like that, you'll find even in Egypt the pictures of like the staff with the winged globe on the top, and on both sides you have the black snake and the white snake, female snake, male snake, positive versus negative. This is why it's interesting that he called it a closed circuit as well. And so when you look at the whole idea that this Kundalini serpent energy thing, which I'm going to be bringing you guys a lot more information on, their whole communal setting is set up in that way. So not only are they coming together to do an actual religious conversation and expounding of religious texts and ideas, but even the very representation of how they're doing it, in my opinion, is a representation of the kind of religious ideas they're practicing. He doesn't say this outright, and this is part of the interesting thing about doing this kind of research, is that one really has to read this and try to look between the lines with as much background information as one can get. So this is as far as I'm concerned, like that to me is an interesting clue. So continuing, section 4, and let me take a quick drink. And these expounders of the law, having first all laid down temperance as a sort of foundation for the soul to rest upon, proceed to build upon other virtues on this foundation. And no one of them may take any meat or drink before the setting of the sun, since they judge that the work of philosophizing is one which is worthy of the light, but that the care of the necessities of the body is suitable only to darkness, on which account they appropriate the day to the one occupation and a brief portion of the night to the other. And some men in whom there is implanted a more fervent desire of knowledge can endure to cherish a recollection of their food for 3 days without even tasting it. And some men are so delighted and enjoy themselves so exceedingly when they are regaled by wisdom, which supplies them with her doctrines and all possible wealth and abundance, that they can even hold out twice as great a length of time, and will scarcely at the end of 6 days taste even necessary food, being accustomed, as they say that grasshoppers are, to feed on air, their song, as I imagine, making their scarcity tolerable to them. And that's an interesting description, because that's something that you definitely find in the yogic culture. People who meditate for days upon days and don't eat a thing, don't drink a thing. Continuing, and they look upon the seventh day as one of the perfect holiness and a most complete festival, have thought it worthy of a most special honor, and on it, having taken due care of their soul, they tend their bodies also, giving them, just as they do their cattle, a complete rest from their continual labors, and they eat nothing of a costly character but plain bread and a seasoning of salt, which the more luxurious of them to further season with hyssop, and their drink is water from the spring, for they oppose those those feelings which nature has made mistresses of the human race, namely hunger and thirst, giving them nothing to flatter or humor them, but only such useful things as it is not possible to exist without them. On this account, they eat only so far as not to be hungry, and they drink just enough to escape from thirst, avoiding all I can never say this word, satiety, as an enemy of and a plotter against both body or soul and body. Now, this is also very interesting too, guys, and I just kind of right now made this connection, but one of the things that's interesting too about the old Pythagorean cult or mystery school or whatever you want to call it, is that there's all these rules about certain things that you don't want to eat, like beans and things like that, because it messes with your bodily functions, which then takes your mind away from the things that you're supposed to be concentrating on. So I think this is part of it. Trying to sort of like conquer your passions, conquer your physical self. Continuing. And there are two kinds of covering, one raiment and the other a house. We have already spoken of their houses, that they are not decorated with any ornaments, but run up in a hurry, being only made to answer such purposes as are absolutely necessary. And in like manner, their raiment is of the most ordinary description, just stout enough to ward off cold and heat, being a cloak of some shaggy hide for winter and a thin mantle or linen shawl in the summer. For in short, they practice entire simplicity, looking upon falsehood as the foundation of pride, but truth as the origin of simplicity, and upon truth and falsehood as standing in the light of fountains, for from falsehood proceeds every variety of evil and wickedness, and from truth there flows every imaginable abundance of good things, both human and divine. I honestly can't argue with that. Section 5. I wish to also speak of their common assemblies and their very cheerful meetings at convivial parties, setting them in opposition and contrast to the banquets of others. For others, when they drink strong wine, as if they had been drinking not wine, but some agitating and maddening kind of liquor, or even the most formidable thing which can be imagined for driving a man out of his natural reason, rage about and tear things to pieces like so many ferocious dogs, rise up and attack one another, biting and gnawing each other's noses and ears, Mike Tyson, and fingers and other parts of their body, so as to give an accurate representation of the story related about the Cyclops and the companions of Ulysses, who ate, as the poet says, fragments of human flesh, and that more savagely than even himself, for he was only avenging himself on those whom he conceived to be his enemies. But they were ill-treated, their companions and friends, and sometimes even their actual relations, while having the salt and dinner table before them at a time of peace, there's a typo here. At a time of peace, perpetrating actions inconsistent with peace, like those which are done as coiners, debased good money, and instead of athletae, becoming miserable men, athlioi, for that is the name which properly belongs to them. So this section here, if you haven't noticed already, is he's basically going into the way that various other people celebrate and kind of, there are cultural celebrations and the differences between how the Therapeutae do it and versus the Greeks and other people. So this is an interesting section, but I'm going to try to blow through this pretty quick. For that which those men who gained victories in the Olympic Games, which were when perfectly sober in the arena and having all the Greeks for spectators do by day, exerting all their skill for the purpose of gaining victory and the crown, these men with base designs do at convivial entertainments, getting drunk by night, in the hour of darkness, when soaked in wine, acting without either knowledge or art or skill, to the insult and injury and great disgrace of those who are subject to their violence. And if no one were to come like an umpire into the middle of them and part the combatants and reconcile them, they would continue the contest with unlimited license, striving to kill and murder one another, and being killed and murdered on the spot. For they do not suffer less than they inflict, though out of the delirious state into which they have worked themselves, they do not feel what is done to them, since they have filled themselves with wine, not, as the comic poet says, to the injury of their neighbor, but to their own. before I continue. Another thing that's really interesting. So this is a book talking about ancient times and ancient peoples. And yes, the type of the ways that people think is very different. I mean, you look 100 years ago, people really did think very different than we do now. But isn't it funny how human nature doesn't seem to change over time? I mean, as this continues, and he starts to explain how some of these people kind of act, like, I bet you anything, you're going to be like, yep, I know people just like that. So, continuing. Therefore, those persons who a little while before came safe and sound to the banquet and in friendship for one another do presently afterwards depart in hostility and mutilating in their bodies. And some of these men stand in need of advocates and judges, and others require surgeons and physicians and the help which they may receive from them. Others again who seem to be more moderate kinds of feasters when they have drunk unmixed wine as if they were mandragora, boil over as it were, and lean on their left elbow and turn their heads on one side with their breath redolent of their wine, till at last they sink into profound slumber, neither seeing nor hearing anything, as if they had but one single sense, that the most lavish of all, namely taste. And I know some persons who, when they are completely filled with wine before they are wholly empowered by it, begin to prepare a drinking party for the next day by a kind of subscription and picnic contribution, conceiving of a great part of their present delight to consist in the hope of future drunkenness. And in this manner they exist to the very end of their lives, without a house and without a home, the enemies of their parents and of their wives and their children, and the enemies of their country, and the worst enemies of all to themselves. For a debauched and profligate life is apt to lay snares for every one. And man, oh man, that is what I mean by, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And yeah. Section 6. And perhaps some people may be inclined to approve the arrangement of such entertainments which at present prevail everywhere, from an admiration of and a desire of imitating the luxury and extravagance of the Italians, which both Greeks and barbarians emulate, making all their preparations with a view to show rather than a real enjoyment. For they use couches called triclinia and sofas all around the table made of tortoise shell and ivory and other costly materials, most of which are inlaid with precious stones and coverlets of purple embroidered with gold and silver thread, and other brocades and flowers of every kind of hue and a color imaginable to allure the sight, and a vast array of drinking cups arrayed according to each separate description, for there are bowls and vases and beakers and goblets and all kinds of other vessels wrought with the most exquisite skill, their clean cups and others finished with the most elaborate refinement of skillful and ingenious men, and well-shaped slaves of the most exquisite beauty, ministering as if they had come not more for the purpose of serving the guests than of delighting the eyes of the spectators by their mere appearance. And of these slaves, some being still boys, pours out the wine, and others more forcefully grown pour water, being carefully washed and rubbed down, with their faces anointed and penciled, and the hair of their heads admirably plaited and curled and wreathed in delicate knots. For they have very long hair, being not either completely unshorn, or else having only the hair on their foreheads cut at the ends, so as to make them of equal length all around, being accurately sloped away as to represent a circular line, and being clothed in tunics of the most delicate texture and of the most purest white, reaching in front down to the lower part of the knee and behind to a little below the calf of the leg, and drawing up each side with a gentle doubling of the fringe at the joining of the tunics, raising undulations of the garment as it were at the sides, and widening them at the hollow part of the side. That was quite the description. But one of the things I love about this book is that you really do kind of get a sense of the way things kind of felt and looked. Continuing, and others again are young men. And this starts to get a little funky here. Just to warn you. Others again are young men just beginning to show a beard on their youthful chins, having been for a short time the sport of the profligate debauchees. That's right. And being prepared with exceeding care and diligence for more painful services, being a kind of exhibition of the excessive opulence of the giver of the feast, or rather, to say the truth, of their thorough ignorance of all property, as those who are acquainted with them well know. Besides all these things, there is an infinite variety of sweetmeats and delicacies and confections, about which the bakers and cooks and confectioners labor, considering not the taste, which is the point of real importance, so as to make the food palatable to that, but also the sight, to as allure that by which delicacy of the look of their viands, the remainder of look of their viands. So this section is interesting too. essentially, I mean, you look at any cooking show, they're doing the same thing, right? It's about presentation and all these things. This idea absolutely was, was present during the ancient world, which is fascinating. Continuing, the material has been recorded to reflect they turn their heads around in every direction, scanning everything with their eyes and with their nostrils, examining the riches and the number of the dishes with the first and the steam which is sent up by them with the second. And then when they are thoroughly sated, both with the sight and the scent, these scenes again prompt their owners to eat, praising in no moderate terms both the entertainment itself and the giver of it for its costliness and magnificence. Accordingly, 7 tables and often more are brought in, full of every kind of delicacy which earth and sea and rivers and air produce, all procured with great pains and in high condition, composed of terrestrial and aquatic and flying creatures, every one of which is different both in its mode of dressing and in its seasoning, and that no description of a thing existing in nature may be omitted at the last dishes are brought in full of fruits, besides those which are kept back for the more luxurious portion of the entertainment, and for what is called the dessert. Interesting. And afterwards, some of the dishes are carried away empty from the insatiable greediness of those at the table, who, gorging themselves like cormorants, devour all the delicacies so completely that they gnaw even the bones, which some have left half devoured after all that they have contained has been torn to pieces and spoiled, and when they are completely tired with eating, having their bellies filled up to their very throats, but their desires still unsatisfied, being fatigued with eating. I used to say that as a kid. I'm full up to here, to my chin. However, when I need, I dwell with proximity on these matters, which are already condemned by the generality of more moderate men as inflaming the passions. Indeed, the diminution of which is desirable. For any one in his senses would pray for the most unfortunate of all states, hunger and thirst, rather than for a most unlimited abundance of meat and drink, as such banquets as these. Section 7. Now, the banquets among the Greeks, the 2 most celebrated and most remarkable are those which Socrates also was present. The one in the house of Callias, when after Autolycus had gained the crown of victory, he gave a feast in honor of the event, and the others in the house of Agathon, which was thought worthy of being commemorated by men who were imbued with the true spirit of philosophy, both in their dispositions and in their discourses. Plato and Xenophon, for they recorded them as events worthy to be had in perpetual recollection. Looking upon it that future generations would take them as a model for as well managed arrangements of future banquets. But nevertheless, even these, if compared with the banquets of the men of our time who have embraced the contemplative system of life, will appear ridiculous. Each description indeed has its own pleasures, but recorded by Xenophon is the one that the delights of which are most in accordance with human nature, for female harp players and dancers and conjurers and jugglers and men who do ridiculous things, who pride themselves much on the power of jesting and amusing others, and many of other species of more cheerful relaxation are brought forward at it. But the entertainment recorded at Plato is almost entirely connected with love, not that of men madly desirous or fond of women, but of women furiously in love with men. For these desires are accomplished in accordance with the law of nature, but that love which is felt by men for one another, differing only in respect of age. For if there is anything in the account that of that banquet elegantly said in praise of genuine love and heavenly Venus, it is introduced merely for the sake of making a neat speech. And here we go. This is when it gets kind of funky. For the greater part of the book is occupied by common, vulgar, promiscuous love, which takes away from the soul courage, which is the most serviceable of all virtues, both in war and in peace, which engenders in it instead the female disease and renders men women. Though they ought rather to be carefully trained in all practices likely to give them valor. So, hopefully I don't really have to spell this out, but, And having corrupted the age of the boys and having metamorphosed them and removed them into the classification and character of women, it has injured their lovers also in the most important particulars, their bodies, their souls, and their properties. For it follows of necessities that the mind of a lover of boys must be kept on the stretch towards the object of his affection, and must have no acuteness of vision for any other object, but must be blinded by its desire as to all other objects, private or common, and must so be wasted away, more especially if it fails in its objects. So, Moreover, the man's property must be diminished on two accounts, both from the owner's neglect and from his expenses for the beloved object, i.e., boys. And so they're talking about pedophilia here. I mean, if you guys didn't figure that out, but specifically pedophilia to little boys or to young boys. There is also another greater evil which affects the whole people, which grows up alongside of one another. For men who give into such passions produce a solitude in cities, and a scarcity of the best kind of men, and barrenness and unproductiveness, inasmuch as they are imitating those farmers who are unskillful in agriculture, and who, instead of the deep-soiled champaign country, sow briny marshes or stony and rugged districts, which are not calculated to produce crops of any kind, and which only destroy the seed which is put into them. I pass over in silence the different fabulous fictions and the stories of persons with two bodies who, having originally been stuck to one another by amatory influences, are subsequently separated like portions which have brought together and are disjoined again, the harmony having been dissolved by which they were held together. For all these things are very attractive, being able by novelty of their imagination to allure the ears, but they are despised by the disciples of Moses. And here we go, our first reference to Judaism or anything like that, who in the abundance of their wisdom have learned from their earliest infancy to love truth, and also continue to the end of their lives impossible to be deceived. Section 8. But since the entertainments of the greatest celebrity are full of such trifling and folly, bearing conviction in themselves, if any one should think fit not to regard vague opinion in the character which has been commonly handed down concerning them as feasts, which have gone off with the most eminent success, I will oppose to them the entertainments of those persons who have devoted their whole life and themselves to the knowledge and contemplation of the affairs of nature in accordance with most sacred admonitions and precepts of the prophet Moses. In the first place, these men assemble at the end of 7 weeks, venerating not only the simple week of 7 days, but also its multiplied power, which is very Pythagorean, by the way. For they know it to be pure and always virgin, and it is a prelude and a kind of forefeast to the greatest feast, which is assigned to the number 50. The most holy and natural of numbers, being compounded of the number of the right-angled triangle, which is the principle of the origination and condition of the whole. Now, if that right there isn't an absolute clue to the Pythagorean element to how he's describing. I mean, this one sentence by itself is, with this one little section, paragraph, is, to me, it just screams Pythagorean stuff. And, if you guys have been watching a lot of my other videos, I've definitely mentioned this element before, and we'll go into it more. Eventually, I'm going to get to doing an audiobook on the biography of Pythagoras, so you'll get a little bit more background information there. Continuing. Therefore, when they come together clothed in white garments and joyful with the most exceeding gravity, when someone of the Therapeutae, for that is the appellation which they are accustomed to give to those who are employed in such administrations, before they sit down to meet, standing in order in a row and raising their eyes and their hands to heaven, the one because they have learnt to fix their attention on what is worthy at looking at, and the other because they are free from the reproach of all impure gain, being never polluted under any pretense whatever by any description of criminality which can rise from any means taken to procure advantage. They pray to God that the entertainment may be acceptable and welcoming and pleasing. And after having offered up these prayers, the elders sit down to meat, still observing the order in which they were previously arranged, for they do not look on those as elders who are advanced in years and very ancient, but in some cases they esteem those in very young men, if they have attached themselves to this sect only lately. But those whom they call elders are those who from their earliest infancy have grown up and arrived at maturity in the speculative portion of philosophy, which is the most beautiful and most divine part of it. So obviously this section, is going back to the Therapeutae here. And another point, which is very good. So, it's not about, in this group of people, it's not about your age. If somebody has reached the level of maturity and philosophy and understanding, then that's respect, and I think that's really kind of a beautiful thing, and a very different aspect of the way quote unquote religions operate. So continuing, and also I'd like to point out too, one of the things that's interesting about Jesus' ministry, and sort of, if you know anything about Jesus' ministry, the story of these people should definitely trigger some thoughts there. But one of the things that I think is interesting too is that there were so many women that were part of that. And in this group of people, unlike the Essenes, or the Qumran Essenes specifically, women were a part of these groups, of this group of people, and I believe that there was more of an equality amongst the sexes here. So just to continue. And the women also share in this feast, the greater part of whom, though old, are virgins in respect of their purity, not indeed through necessity, as some of the priestesses among the Greeks are, who have been compelled to preserve their chastity more than they would have done on their own accord, but out of an admiration for and love of wisdom, for which they are desirous to pass their lives, on account of which they are indifferent to the pleasures of the body, desiring not a mortal but an immortal offspring, which the soul that is attached to God is alone able to produce by itself and from itself, the Father having sown in its rays of light, appreciable only by the intellect, by means of which it will be able to perceive the doctrines of wisdom. Now that's a very interesting paragraph as well, and one of the things I find, so there are two things here. First of all, when they talk about many of them being old and them being virgins, and sort of talking about like, oh, it's, on an account for love of wisdom and all that stuff. I mean, he could very well be just referring to the fact that that people grow up and then they renounce sex, and then they are in a way, quote unquote, born again as a virgin, and that's how they live their lives. And so that could be part of it. But here's another interesting part of it when it comes to, say, stories of the quote unquote nativity. What if it actually kind of means where desiring not a mortal but an immortal offspring, which the soul that is attached to God is alone able to produce by itself from itself. Interesting, right? When it comes to the idea of like the nativity story or whatever else, just the way he writes is sometimes vague, and this is an interesting comment that he makes, and it makes me wonder if the whole idea of the nativity thing comes from this type of tradition. Anyways, I'll continue here. Section 9. And the order in which they sit down to meat is a divided one, the men sitting on the right hand, and the women apart from them on the left hand. Yet again, and in the case one by chance suspects that cushions, if not very costly ones, still at all events of a tolerably soft substance, are prepared for men who are well born and well bred and contemplators of philosophy, he must know that they have nothing but rugs of the coarsest material, cheap mats of the most ordinary kind of papyrus of the land, piled on the ground and projecting a little near the elbow, so that the fasters may lean upon them, for they relax in a slight degree the Lacedaemonian rigor of life, and at all times and in all places they practice a liberal, gentlemanlike kind of frugality, hating the allurements of pleasure with all their might. And they do not use the administrations of slaves, looking upon the possessions of servants of slaves to be a thing of absolutely and wholly contrary to nature. For nature has created all men free, but the injustice and covetousness of some men who prefer inequality, that cause of all evil, having subdued some, has given to the more powerful authority over those who are weaker. Okay, I couldn't agree with you more. Accordingly, in this sacred entertainment there is, as I have said, no slave, but free men minister to the guests, performing the offices of servants, not under compulsion or in obedience to any imperious commands, but of their own voluntary free will, with all eagerness and promptitude, anticipating all orders. For they are not any chance free men who are appointed. For they are not any chance free men who are appointed to perform these duties, but young men who are selected from their order with all possible care on account of their excellence, acting as virtuous and well-born youths ought to act, who are eager to attain to the perfection of virtue, and who, like legitimate sons, with affectionate rivalry minister to their fathers and mothers, thinking their common parents more closely connected with them than those who are related by blood, since in truth, to men of right principles, there is nothing more nearly akin than virtue, and they come in to perform their service, and with their tunics let down, in order that nothing which bears any resemblance to a lavish appearance, they may be introduced into this festival. And this whole thing with, members of the order not being slaves, not being service, but this is something that they do on their own cognizance. It's something that's part of their service, as part of their spiritual upbringing, which, again, is another tradition that you find in both Buddhism and in the yogic culture, big time. So, continuing. I know well that some persons will only laugh when they hear this, but they who laugh will be those who do things worthy of weeping and lamentation, and in those days wine is not introduced, but only the clearest water, cold water for the generality, and hot water for those men who are accustomed to a luxurious life. Ooh. And the table too bears nothing which has blood, but there is placed upon it bread for food and salt for seasoning, to which also hyssop is sometimes added as an extra sauce for the sake of those who are delicate in their eating. For just as right reason commands the priests to offer up sober sacrifices, so also these men are commanded to live sober lives, for wine is the medicine of folly, and costly seasonings and sauces excite desire, which is the most insatiable of all beasts. These, then, are the first circumstances of the feast, but after the guests have sat down to the table in the order which I have been describing, and when those who minister them are all standing around in order, ready to wait upon them, and when there is nothing to drink, someone will say, but even more so than before, so that no one ventures to mutter or even breathe at all hard, and then someone looks out some passage in the sacred scriptures, or explains some difficulty which is proposed by someone else without any thoughts of display on his own part, for he is not aiming at reputation for cleverness and eloquence, but is only desirous to see some points more accurately, and is content when he has thus seen them himself, not to bear ill will to others, who, even if they did not perceive the truth, will, with equal acuteness, have at all events an equal desire of learning. So that is great. I mean, that's the way it should be. Not the way that things have devolved into, and such a long time ago. And it's all nothing but like this insane debate on this and that and all this other stuff, when it's like people haven't learned what they should learn, put it down, and then put some of this into practice. You know what I'm saying? Because that's one of the reasons I started this channel, is because I learned that lesson, and this description of these people and how they do that is a very good example of how these people at this time period were doing the same things, and they are very much a lot like I keep saying, in the Eastern cultures, the yogic and Buddhist cultures, they do similar things in this, especially in the yogic culture. So continuing. And he indeed follows a slower method of instruction, dwelling on and lingering over his explanations with repetitions in order to imprint his conceptions deep in the minds of his hearers. For as the understanding of his hearers is not able to keep up with the interpretation of those who go on fluently without stopping to take breath, it gets behindhand and fails to comprehend what is said. But the hearers, fixing their eyes and attention upon the speaker, remain in one and the same position, listening attentively, indicating their attention and comprehension by their nods and looks, and the praise which they are inclined to bestow on the speaker of the cheerfulness and gentle manner in which they follow him with their eyes, and the forefinger of their right hand, and the young men who are standing around attending to his explanation no less than the guests themselves who are sitting at meat. And these explanations of the sacred scriptures are delivered by mystic expressions in allegories, for the whole of the law appears to these men to resemble a living animal, and its express commandments seem to be the body, the invisible meaning concealed under and lying beneath the plain words resemble the soul, in which the rational soul begins most excellently to contemplate what belongs to itself as in a mirror, beholding in these very words the exceeding beauty of the sentiments, and unfolding and explaining the symbols, and bringing the secret meaning naked to the light, to all who are able, by the light of a slight intimation, to perceive what is unseen by what is visible. This entire paragraph right here, and I have the book or the link to this book in the description box if you guys want to read it. But I could unpack this whole thing. I'm not going to do it now because this video will never end. But this whole section here, and I'm just going to read this again, okay, for emphasis. And these explanations of the sacred scriptures are delivered by mystic expressions and allegories, for the whole of the law appears to these men to resemble a living animal. How much do you want to bet that living animal is a snake? Okay? And expresses commandments seem to be, it expresses commandments seem to be the body. So, i.e., Kundalini Yoga. An invisible meaning concealed under and lying beneath the plain words resembles the soul, in which the rational soul begins most excellently to contemplate what belongs to itself, as in a mirror, beholding in these very words the exceeding beauty of the sentiments, and unfolding an explanation, explaining the symbols, and bringing the secret meaning naked to the light to all who are able, by the light of a slight intimation, to perceive what is unseen by what is visible. So, i.e., being able to see through these texts to what it's really saying to you. And this idea here with the invisible meaning concealed under and lying beneath the plain words resemble the soul, in which the rational soul begins most excellent to contemplate what belongs to itself as in a mirror, is expressed in one of the Vedic, well, let's say Hindu Upanishads books. I mean, almost exactly the way he writes it here. I'm going to have to dig this up, and I'll do a comparison video, less than like an audiobook, but I wanted to point this out. This is such an important paragraph in this entire book. It really gives you another great clue about really what's going on here. So continuing. When, therefore, the president appears to have spoken at sufficient length and to have carried out his intentions adequately so that his explanations has gone on felicitously and fluently through his own acuteness, and the hearing of others has been profitable, applause arises from them all as of men rejoicing together at what they have seen and heard. And then someone rising up sings a hymn which has been made in honor of God, either such as he has composed himself, or some ancient one of some old poet. For they have left behind them many poems and songs in trimeter iambics, and in psalms of thanksgiving, and in hymns and songs at the time of libation, and at the altar, and in regular order, and in choruses, admirably measured out in various and well diversified strophes. And after him then others also arise in their ranks, and in becoming order, while everyone else listens in decent silence, except when it is proper for them to take up the burden of the song and to join in at the end, for then they all, both men and women, join in the hymn. And when each individual has finished his psalm, and the young men bring in the table which was mentioned a little while ago, on which was placed the most holy food, the leavened bread, which with a seasoning of salt, with which, of course, hyssop is mingled out of reverence for the sacred table, which lies thus in the holy outer temple. For on this table are placed loaves and salt without seasoning, and the bread is unleavened, and the salt unmixed with anything else. For it was becoming that the simplest and purest things should be allotted to the most excellent portion of the priests, as a reward for their administrations, and that the others should admire similar things, but should abstain from the loaves, in order that those who are more excellent persons may have the precedence. In section 11. And after the feast, they celebrate the sacred festival during the whole night, and this nocturnal festival is celebrated in the following manner. They all stand up together in the middle of the entertainment. Two choruses are formed at first, the one of men, the other of women, and for each chorus there is a leader and chief selected, who is the most honorable and most excellent of the band. Then they sing hymns, which have been composed in honor of God in many meters and tunes, at one time all singing together, at another moving their hands and dancing in corresponding harmony, and uttering in an inspired manner songs of thanksgiving, and at another time regular odes, and performing all necessary strophes and antistrophes. Then, when each chorus of men and each chorus of women have feasted, separated by itself, like persons in the bacchanalian revels, drinking the pure wine of the love of God, that's really what it's supposed to mean. They join together, and the two become one chorus, an imitation of that one which in old time, and here we go. And this is him, I'm just going to stop real quick. This is him interjecting a Jewish idea onto these people. And I'm not, I take this kind of how he writes it, on the basis of whatever, but the way that he writes this seems like he's just he's comparing it. Okay. He's not actually telling you that this is why they do it. But here he says, so they join together, and the two become one chorus, an imitation of that one which in old time was established by the Red Sea on account of the wondrous works which were displayed there. For by the commandment of God the sea became To one party, the cause of safety, and the other, that of utter destruction, for it being burst asunder and dragged back by a violent reflux and being built up on each side as if it were a solid wall, the space in the midst was widened and cut into a level and dry road, along with which the people passed over to the opposite land, being conducted onwards to higher ground. Then when the sea returned and ran back to its former channel, and was poured out from both sides on what had just before been dry ground, those of the enemy who pursued were overwhelmed and perished. You see what I mean? Like, I don't know. I don't think that's like it. Yeah, for me, I think he's projecting that on these people. Because he doesn't actually tell you. He's like as an imitation. I'm like, okay. So continuing, when the Israelites saw and experienced this great miracle, which was an event beyond all description, beyond all imagination, and beyond all hope, both men and women together, under the influence of divine inspiration, became all one chorus, singing hymns of thanksgiving to God the Savior. Moses the prophet leading the men, and Miriam the prophetess leading the women. Now you see, I think that what he's doing here, honestly, is that he has created a way to diverge from the real reason why these people do it, and it has to do with the principles of music that were expounded and widely distributed by the Pythagorean schools. So, and Pythagorean school is not a Jewish school. So I think he wrote this whole thing as a way to just kind of like gloss over the whole thing. Because isn't it interesting that we have none of Pythagoras' actual works, but people that were part of his, schools that inherited it over time. So, continuing, we're almost done here. Now, the chorus of female and male worshippers were being formed as far as possible on this model, makes a most humorous concert and truly musical symphony. The shrill voices of the women mingling with the deep-toned voices of the men. The ideas were beautiful and expressions beautiful, and the chorus singers were beautiful, and the end of ideas and expressions in chorus singers was piety. Therefore, being intoxicated all night till the morning with this beautiful intoxication, divine intoxication, without feeling their heads heavy or close their eyes for sleep, but being even more awake than when they came to the feast, as to their eyes and their whole bodies. And standing there till morning, when they saw the sun rising, they raised their hands to heaven, imploring tranquility in truth and acuteness of understanding. And after their prayers, they each retired to their own separate abodes, with the intention of again practicing the usual philosophy to which they had been wont to devote themselves. This, then, is what I have to say of those who are called Therapeutae, who have devoted themselves to the contemplation of nature, and who have lived in it and in the soul alone, being citizens of heaven and of the world, and very acceptable to the Father and Creator of the universe, because of their virtue, which has procured them his love as their most appropriated reward, which far surpasses all the gifts of fortune, and conducts them to the very summit and perfection of happiness. So, let's So this book, that's the end. This book here, we have a lot of really interesting information that we've gone through, and I think one of the really interesting clues that we have, the description of this sect of people is not like it's similar in a lot of ways to the Essenes, but in many ways not so much, because. They have there's so many different clues in this book that I had thrown out there. And, and one of the things that is interesting is that in southern India, there are festivals exactly how they explain these all-night festivals where there's no alcohol, there's none of this stuff. It's music, it's singing, it's meditation, it's devotion, and it's all night long, and it is explained exactly the way that it's described in this book, and that's pretty interesting. I mean, it's just one of those things where I think people are, this is like a little window into the mystery of Jesus in early Christianity, because the early church fathers, they recognize the Therapeutae as being sort of the beginning of the Christian monasticism, and this whole idea of having, monasteries and things like that, which, in my opinion, they existed before then, but it's just one of those things that, because history's been so well wiped out, it's hard to be able to kind of, be able to find these clues, because my opinion, and what I'm going to be showing you guys in the next couple of months, because I'm going to be spending a lot more time doing a lot more videos now that I have this new computer, is that we have there's a lot of clues, and there's a lot of historical clues. There's a lot of coins and various other things which kind of show you that, okay, there's something going on here. There is definitely a mingling of East and West, and as I bring this up, I'll show you guys. So much love to all of you guys. I really appreciate you stopping by and taking a listen. I hope you guys learned something you didn't know beforehand, and about the Therapeutae, and sort of about these people. And if you're well versed in your Bible and Christianity, there'll be quite a few little things that may have stood out to you when it comes to this particular writing. But I have a link in the end here, in the description box, to the actual book, and I also have a link to all the other books that he's written out. So if you guys enjoyed listening to this audiobook and some of my commentary, please hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't done so, if you like this kind of material. And I will be back a little later, possibly in another half an hour or so, with something really interesting. Let me see if I can actually share this with you guys real quick. Yeah, let's see here. And there we go. So I have this book, The Crucifixion by an Eyewitness, a letter written 7 years after the crucifixion by a personal friend of Jesus in Jerusalem to an Asir, or Essene, or Therapeutae, brother in Alexandria. So there's that one. And then there's The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, from an ancient manuscript recently discovered in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet by Nicholas Notovich. Both of these are very controversial books, but they're also pretty interesting. And one of the things that's going to be really cool to go into these books is the fact that it's going to give us some more clues here. It's going to give us a couple more clues with a lot of the research that I've already been doing, but a bunch of the more detailed research that I'm going to bring it in. So thank you so much for joining me on this, and I will probably see you guys in an hour or so. I got a few things to do, throw some logs in the fire, eat, make sure my chickens are still good, and I will be back with you guys in a little bit. Okay, peace.